Hello, everyone, and thanks for coming. I am a Pollinator Conservation Specialist at the East National Technology Support Center. So I'm what's called a partner biologist with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And I'm located in Greensboro, North Carolina on Sissipaha, Eno, Saponi, and Shakori land. And so I will go ahead and move to the next slide, if I can remember how to do that. So today's program was built for city planners and designers, and there's an awful lot that I would love to share with you. And so I probably tried to pack too much into our 1 hour. So I may kind of skim over some slides, but don't worry, all the slides are posted at the tiny URL there, and it's in the chat box if you want to click on that so you can get a copy of the slides. And then I also posted additional resources. Most of the things that I reference in the slides are in those additional resources. I did add a few things to this program that aren't in there, and I will try to update that. But everything's on the slide itself, so you should be able to find everything that I talk about. So I usually focus mainly on native bees because my background is in crop pollination with a focus on native bees. But for this series that Rachel developed, she really wanted us to focus on plants. And so I will talk about pollinators a little bit, but the focus is going to be really on trees. I think a lot of us generally hear more about the perennial wildflowers for pollinators. And so I hope that you'll bear with me giving a little more emphasis to trees today, partly because of the benefits of trees for providing shade, but lots of other reasons as well. So anyway, then. Okay, so in terms of take-home messages, the emphasis today is really on enhancing diversity, so floral diversity and structural diversity. So we generally think about needing to have pollinator habitat through the growing season, and also for overwintering. And then we also need structural diversity. So oftentimes, as I said, we tend to think of pollinator plants as wildflowers, but shrubs and trees are excellent. And in terms of insect diversity, having as many niches as possible in anywhere is going to add more diversity in terms of the more diverse your plants, the more diverse your insects. So, all right, and then pollinator plantings have multiple benefits. So if you need to sell these plantings to your town council, you can remind them of all the other good things that pollinator plantings do: protecting water quality, improving water infiltration, increasing transpiration, providing shade when trees are used, and that can really help reduce heat. And I have a couple slides that are about some gardening trends. It's from a magazine that does an analysis of gardening trends every year, and I didn't have a chance to look up this year's media analysis, but anyway, so I hope that'll be of interest. It's kind of neat to see what millennials care about, and so that's another selling point for these plantings. And then, you know, the folks that are attending this program, you all already know a lot more than most of your neighbors. So you can really help raise awareness and appreciation for connections between plants, wildlife, and our own well-being. And I really, really, really appreciate your interest in all the things you're doing in your own communities. So the Xerces Society is a nonprofit organization, and we work to protect wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitat. And we'll be celebrating 50 years in 2021. We take our name from the first butterfly known to go extinct in the US, the Xerces blue butterfly, the first butterfly to go extinct due to habitat loss. And it's in the gossamer winged butterfly family, Lycanidae, that includes our eastern-tailed blue butterfly. Many of our pollinator team members, including me, are partner biologists with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, supporting farm bill programs. So we often are talking more to farm audiences or the partner biologists that support farmlands. So I feel so lucky to be a part of Xerces and wish I could spend more time with all the other staff learning about all they're doing. We have really amazing set of resources on our website. And if you're interested in any of these other topics, you can spend days exploring all the resources there. And today's program is sponsored by Bee City USA and Bee Campus USA. And it's especially relevant for all of you, and I suspect many of you are probably Bee City USA or Bee Campus USA affiliates. And but for those that aren't familiar with the program, the mission of Bee City USA and Bee Campus USA is to galvanize communities to sustain native pollinators by increasing the abundance of native plants, providing nest sites, and reducing the use of pesticides. So our affiliates are among the most creative and delightful people on earth, and they're raising awareness and improving our lives every minute. And so if you're looking for inspiration, you can check out a lot of their work on our Bee City website. They do annual reports every year that include photographs, and it's really inspirational. And these are our cities, and you can see the Southeast is going really strong. So thank you all for everything that you do. And I'm okay. Alrighty. And then we're so grateful to all the collaborators and for everyone working to understand and support invertebrates and their habitat needs around the globe. We are donor supported, and our membership administrator, Laura Rost, wanted me to remind you of these membership perks. Members also receive our magazine, Wings. We receive support from Xerces members and these groups. Thanks again. With the pandemic, I've been visiting some roadside areas more often and discovered several natural populations of Zizia, or golden Alexander for Lavita, who's transcribing this. And I had my first sighting of this tiny little fairy moth whose flight is really awkward with these gigantic antennae and totally miraculous. And I watched it struggling to get a meal from the flower when the wind picked up. So again, thank you all for your interest in learning more about pollinator conservation in the Southeast and all you do to support diversity in your own communities. Special thanks to our wonderful Bee City and Bee Campus USA affiliates and our volunteer ambassadors. I wonder how many of you have ever seen one of these pipevine swallowtail caterpillars. If you have, you know that they usually start out as a group of little tiny caterpillars that hang out together, and they're, a photograph doesn't do them justice. They're like chocolate velvet with bright red spots. And if you've had them, you wonder how the plants can survive, because by the time they're done feeding, there's basically nothing left except the stem. But you would also know that the plant bounces back beautifully, and while those caterpillars are becoming butterflies. So I wanted to draw your attention to Kelly Gill's beautiful presentation from earlier this month. She covered some things in more detail than I will today, including pollinator losses. So I tried to include somewhat different details, assuming folks might watch both. I usually start my programs by sharing one of these video montages to highlight bee diversity mainly, since that is mainly what I have focused on. And so they're designed so you can talk over them. Xerces' Emily May is working on some videos for us and created some beautiful pieces for a project that we collaborated on, integrated crop pollination. And you can find those on Xerces' YouTube channel. But if you want to find these two that I put together, it's on my personal Melitology Nancy channel. So just search on SWVA bees to find it. Okay, and I also want to let folks know about the second in a 3-part series we're doing for NRCS that's coming up on November 4th. These are posted on the conservationwebinars.net site. And besides this program, we've done many other ones in the past that are, you know, Xerces NRCS co-sponsored programs. So now on to building pollinator habitat in towns and cities. This happens to be a specialist bee. I'm going to mention endemic plants a little bit later. And this is one of the plants in our region that is unique to the region. It's called Parnassia acerifolia. And there's 2 other species in our region, and it has a specialist bee called the Parnassia bee that pollinates it. So all wildlife, including us, depends on insect and in food webs to keep us healthy. When bears get into honeybee colonies, they're going after the honeybee larvae more than the honey. The larvae are protein rich. Birds, even if they are primarily seed eaters as adults, nearly all feed insects to their young. These 3 books really help people understand why all this is important. So I just like to recommend those for anybody that's new to this endeavor. Of course, you all know we depend on insect pollinators for food, but we also depend on them for forage crops, biofuels, fibers, medicines, and construction materials. Ollerton and Company estimated that 90% of wild plants depend on animal pollinators. That's an average between about 95% in tropical areas and about 75 to 85% plants, wild plants in temperate areas. So Doug Talamy estimates that chickadees, relatively small birds, need about 5,000 caterpillars for 1 clutch of babies. Can you imagine all those unseen caterpillars in the trees and shrubs around you? Birds and bees are what are called central place foragers. They bring food back to their nests. If they have to travel too far to find food, they won't be successful. In one study that Talamy's grad student did in the District of Columbia, all of the nests that had failed had sunflower seeds in them. So sunflower seeds are tremendously rich in protein and excellent food for adult birds, but young baby birds need soft caterpillars. And they also need the particular nutrients, including carotenes, that give color to their feathers in order to grow and mature into adult birds. So I stuck a little mention of beaver in here because the terrible flooding much of our region has faced. A wonderful botanist and ecologist, Cecil Frost, has shared research showing that in areas with beaver damage, in areas with beaver, damage from flooding is greatly reduced compared to similar areas where beaver have been extirpated. And this is because the soils affected by beaver dams have improved infiltration compared to other soils. And so this kind of disturbance that beavers did historically and still do in some areas, when, you know, it's hard for us to see the trees dying or trees knocked over from either being flooded or being cut by the beaver. But that disturbance opens up the canopy and it brings in a whole set of species just for maybe a relatively short period of time, but that benefits the whole regional ecology in general. And so here in the Southeast, we've had other kinds of disturbance historically, particularly fire. And fire is very, very important for our longleaf pine ecosystems. And almost every ecosystem Where we have rare plant communities, those are fire dependent, and part of the reason some of those plants are rare now is because fire has been suppressed. So we use the word disturbance generally as something bad. So when we talk about mowing or herbicide use, we think, well, that's always you know, going to be hurting plants, but some disturbance is part of natural cycles, and so some mowing actually imitates natural cycles. So I used to collect wildflower seeds for a wildflower seed company, and some of our power line rights of ways had the most diverse native plant communities for some of our wildflowers as any other places. Around here, we see lots of wonderful communities on our roadsides. And again, those sometimes get herbicided, and that can harm some of the species, but the mowing regimes or the periodic disturbance actually is what is maintaining that diversity. It's just when it's too often that it becomes really detrimental over time. So we're facing steep insect declines. Based on global analyses, we can assume losses are comparable with other areas. But in David Wagner's 2020 review, he highlights the lack of studies in the Southeast. So this little map here, and I guess you guys can see my arrow when I put it over here, but you can see where he actually mapped where studies of insect declines have been done around the world. So factors causing declines include habitat destruction, agricultural intensification, including pesticide use, climate change, invasive species, atmospheric nitrification from burning fossil fuels. And I think this is also part of the problem with some of our invasive species. They've benefited from increased nitrogen. The effects of drought and changing precipitation patterns also affect these issues. So wildlife biologists in the Southeast have documented declines in biodiversity, but more is known about megafauna like birds, mammals, amphibians, reptiles that depend on insects for food. So we're facing high frequency and more extended periods of high temperatures in other parts of the US. Heat stress affects animals and plants and can affect the availability of nectar and pollen. So as I'm talking today, I'm often going to be emphasizing protecting riparian areas. And in urban areas, riparian areas have the extra benefit of being a wonderful place for people to go enjoy nature, hear the sound of water, but also be in shady areas. For pollinators, those riparian areas, especially when we go through periods of drought, are very important for providing nectar and pollen. So, and also in urban areas, when we have trees for shade, besides providing the coolness of the shade, they actually reduce the need for air conditioning in buildings, and so that further reduces the extra energy that causes heat in an urban situation. And I'm sorry, I'm struggling with using the mouse on the wrong screen, in case you're wondering why there's a big pause every time. So already on the positive side, the Southeast is really special. In 2015, the North American coastal plain was recognized by the IUCN as a global biodiversity hotspot due to the high number of endemic plants. So I mentioned that Parnassia plant, and endemic just means that it's only found in a very limited area and is unique to a very specific location. Its distribution is not broad. And the second factor that led to the Southeast being a global biodiversity hotspot, unfortunately, is the high rate of habitat loss, so greater than 70% habitat loss. And for the longleaf pine ecosystems, that loss is much, much, much higher. And according to Dr. Sally Kerner, here at UNCG Greensboro, natural longleaf pine ecosystems are only second in diversity following tropical rainforests on small spatial scales. So they've looked at a tropical rainforest and compared the number of species on, say, a 1 meter square area, and longleaf pine is only second to those areas in terms of global biodiversity. So it's pretty amazing. When you look at the system, you mainly see those big trees and you see the grasses that are very important for helping to carry fire. But within those grasses and trees is a tremendous diversity in the longleaf pine systems that are intact. So urban land area increased more than twice the rate of population growth from 1945 to 2012. And 80% of US population lives in towns and cities now. So there's a lot of potential benefits for any work you're doing to support pollinators in urban areas, not only in terms of the actual on-the-ground pollinator habitat, but in terms of raising awareness of the importance of these critters for our world. So what can communities do to support pollinators? Become a Bee City USA or a Bee Campus USA. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but the work that bee cities and bee campuses are doing is super creative and connecting with communities, and it's really, really powerful. So it's just a wonderful community of volunteers. And so in terms of planning and education, if you're a planner, be sure to include groundspeople in the planning process. And so I have a slide later on that I hope I'll have a chance to talk about that a little bit more. But provide at least some shade so people can enjoy in the heat of summer. Sometimes I've talked to people like when they're doing rails to trails planting. They're really excited. They want to put in pollinator habitat and put in all wildflowers, but you need to have some trees along that rails to trails so people will use it on a hot sunny day in the middle of summer. So it doesn't mean that you have to have a thick canopy of trees, but and one of the famous native plant horticulturalist, Colston Burrell, who used to curate the National Arboretum's native plant collection. What he does is if he has big shade trees, he'll trim them up so that you still get that wonderful feeling of being in a forest, but by trimming up the tree a little bit, a lot more light is let into the understory. So there's a lot more diversity below that, but you still get that wonderful shade and much greater diversity. So provide opportunities and recognition for businesses to support pollinators. And so another thing that bee cities and bee campuses do is partner with businesses. And the first one was started in Asheville, North Carolina. And businesses, even little tiny businesses like a single person selling face creams would donate 1 or 2% on a couple days, and you know that's a big deal for that small business, and people buying that, you know, really appreciate that connection, and so it's really important to provide ways for businesses to be recognized. And then adding signs, creating a blog, creating an interactive map to show connectivity. This is something that one of the NRCS partners up in New York did when they were trying to promote planting butterfly habitat. So I talked about bees being central place forager. They have to have their habitat close to their nesting site. But butterflies, they fly through the landscape. So if you have patches of butterfly habitat, and then you can see how those are connecting on a map, then you can inspire somebody in that area where there's no habitat to put in something, or maybe try to partner with someone in that area to add more connectivity. So, and then I talked a little bit already about adding diversity. Or maybe I'm not, maybe I didn't. But plant natives wherever possible and avoid invasive species. So um, we aren't pedantic about using only natives, but we really would like you to avoid using invasive species. And this can be hard sometimes because a lot of our nurseries still sell invasive species. And on the one hand, a state agency will be regulating something as invasive, and then the nurseries are still selling it. And so if you're not sure what's invasive or not, you can usually find that on your state native plant society, or if you have any trouble figuring out if something is invasive, please contact me and I'll help you find where to find that information. And then reducing mowing. So one of the groups, Wild Ones, that was first started planting prairie habitat up in the Midwest. They were one of the first groups to encourage people to let their lawns go back to prairie. And if you've ever been in the Midwest, a native prairie can be 8 or 9 or 10 feet tall. So that's a pretty dramatic change from turf. So they got a lot of pushback. But one of the things you can do if you stop mowing, and of course, our native prairies around here generally aren't quite that tall. But if you stop mowing, as long as you let people know it's intentional, then usually they're okay with it. So you can have a clear mowed edge that lets people know, or a fence, or signs. And signs are really an excellent way to help start conversations. And then leave the leaves. And I had hoped to include a slide about this. Xerces has a whole program and a wonderful poster that you can print about leave the leaves. And lots of wildlife live in the leaves over winter. And of course, one of the things we do in parks is clear out all the leaves. We mow all the grass around all those big trees. There's no understory trees taking their places. So one of the things, a wonderful landscape architect, Leslie Sauer, who wrote The Once and Future Forest, and her company Andropogon up in the Philadelphia area promoted, was in a park system, gathering a few trees, an area that has historically been, every bit of it has been mown under those big trees, make an area that is no longer mown. So you can make an island where there's some natural regeneration of small trees and shrubs and wildflowers in that area. And, you know, because it's an island in that grass and people know it's intentional, depending on the invasive species in the area, you'll have to keep an eye on those and keep those out. But that can be really valuable for pollinators, but also over time, as those big trees in those parks die, then you won't have just this huge gap without trees. You'll have an area of natural regeneration. So, and then you need to protect these plantings or pollinator areas by eliminating or reducing pesticide use and leaving some overwintering habitat. And then the other thing that our bee cities and bee campuses do wonderfully is celebrating the community's support of pollinators. All right, so I'm hoping to kind of go through all of these a little bit in the next few slides, but we may need to go a little bit quickly, so I hope you'll bear with me if that happens. So adding diversity temporally and structurally, so temporally being through the growing season, and then structurally, so you want to have a diversity of species in each season. And Xerces has some really wonderful pollinator habitat assessment tools, and we have a brand new one for towns and home gardens. And I have a slide later showcasing that. And then on the additional resources, there's a link. If you just go to Google and type Xerces habitat assessment, you'll find all those as well. So pollinators and other Insects depend on diverse plants for food and shelter. Understanding a little bit more about pollinator habitat needs can guide conservation. So just slowing down and taking a closer look will let you see how many visitors your plants are supporting. Bees and other insects on flowers will never sting. So we sometimes find people, if you mention pollinator habitat at a school, they're worried about stinging or they're worried about allergies. And the only bees and wasps that would sting are when you're around their nests. And if you see a bee or a wasp on a flower, if you get too close, it's just going to fly away. And the vast majority of our bees and wasps are actually solitary. And so they don't have a colony to defend. They don't have a queen. They just get provisions and lay an egg. They never see their young. So those bees, if you're around their nest, they're not defensive. They're not dangerous at all. It's only honeybees and social wasps like yellow jackets, and then bumblebees, if you're around their nests, will actually give you a little warning buzz that you're getting too close. Unlike honeybees and yellow jackets, you just cross some invisible line and then you know you've done that. But the vast majority of our bees and wasps, if you are near their nest, they're not dangerous at all. So that's why you can put in a bee observation box, and you'll have solitary bees and wasps nest in those. And they're really fun for helping people realize that they don't have to be afraid, and also just seeing how they nest. So when planting for pollinators and other quote-unquote beneficial insects, it's important to provide pollen and nectar through the growing season. So I just wanted to mention this term, beneficial insects. I mainly work with farmers, and so we are promoting beneficial insects, which include pollinators and then predators and parasitoids of pests. And so those are beneficial to agriculture. And of course, if you're an ecologist, you know that everything has a role in our ecosystems and everything is important. So everything is good. But we use this term beneficial insect to actually refer to a whole group of arthropods, not just true insects that include spiders and ladybugs. And it's just a shorthand because it's other terms we use are natural enemies, or sometimes we use the word biocontrol agents, but it can be kind of cumbersome. But just keep in mind when you're talking to people, be aware that maybe you need to remind people that all insects are beneficial, and that we're using that term just in a very specific context, and when you're speaking to farmers. So in terms of plants, many trees and shrubs are especially important in spring. And again, riparian habitats are especially important during times of drought. Fall blooming plants are vital for migrating insects such as monarch butterflies. So most of our NRCS plantings require 3 species that bloom in spring, 3 species that bloom in summer, and 3 that bloom in late summer or fall. So early spring blooming native trees include maple, serviceberry, pawpaw, hawthorn, silverbell, crabapple, cherry, and willow. In spring, these trees are especially important for birds, for the caterpillars that eat the tender new leaves and are fed by birds to their young. Spring flowering is vital for pollinators, but in fall and winter, those with berries are especially important for birds. The berries, like hawthorns, can be very beautiful and also made into jellies for home enjoyment or additional income. And of course, we have the mayhaw jelly in the Southeast, which is wonderful. And depending on the species, birds may wait until late winter to feast. One of the very first trees to bloom in spring is the serviceberry or amelanchier. And again, this is just the most delicious fruit. And I share it whenever I can find the fruit. And almost everybody actually goes to find the tree to pick some for themselves because they enjoy it so much. And these berries, when they're ripe, turn dark blue, and they have been used traditionally by Native Americans to make pemmican. And pemmican is a combination of actually dried meat and fruits. So magnolias are really wonderful and typical trees in the Southeast. We have a huge diversity of magnolias. Beetles mess in soil to pollinate magnolia flowers, but the fragrant nectar is very attractive to bees as well. As you can see, this bee was really fighting to get in there to get some of that nectar. So I wonder how many of you might think of black cherry as a weed tree. The eastern tent caterpillars prefer cherries, but they also feed on ash, birch, willow, maple, oak, and poplar, and are eaten by lots of birds. Blue-gray gnatcatchers use the silk from the caterpillars in nest construction. And I've included a link to Michael Dunn's blog, The Road's End Naturalist. And if any of you are interested in wonderful stories and photographs of nature up close, I encourage you to subscribe to his blog. But I included the one specific to the gnatcatcher nest that uses those caterpillar threads. And according to Doug Tallamy, trees in the genus Prunus support more than 400 species of insects, including this red-spotted butterfly, red-spotted purple. And so I don't know if you can see, but I put little arrows showing where the eggs are that she has just finished laying. Thanks to Judy Starrand with the NC Native Plant Society. So redbud is considered one of the most important early spring flowers for bees. And you may notice telltale signs of the leaves from leaf cutters later in the season. And I've found leaf cutter holes on a lot of different legumes. So redbud, as you can see from the flowers, is in the pea family or legume family. And so certain plants have certain phytochemicals in them that are good for cavity nesting bees. And so leaf cutters in particular, they nest when it's kind of the hottest and most humid part of the year. And so they need plants that will help reduce mold growth where they have laid their eggs. And so they pick plants that work pretty well for that. All right, and we have two species of silver bell, and this is one of the most beautiful trees in the Southeast. And I learned about native plants mainly in Maryland and Virginia, and these get used in landscape up there, but they aren't actually native to those regions. And Rick Dark, if you've ever read any of his books, he planted a small grove at his house in Pennsylvania, Southeast Pennsylvania, about 5 trees. And it's just a spectacular tree, and the bees just love it. You can see how packed with pollen it is. So it's an excellent, excellent pollinator plant. So we have 2 species, one that's very, very tall that grows in the mountains, but the other one is used more typically in the landscape. That's Halesia diptera, or 2-winged silverbell. And I learned today that it's also called 2-winged snowdrop. So mid to late spring blooming trees include persimmon, holly, tulip tree, black gum, sourwood, black locust, and basswood. Of course, persimmons are fantastic food for us and other wildlife, foxes, raccoons, and bears, depending on where you live. And how many of you, I wonder, have eaten black locust flowers? They're sweet and tender, and you just need to brush off the blossoms in case there's any little tiny sugar ants on them. Early spring blooming native shrubs and small trees include maple. I'm thinking of striped maple in the mountains, Acer pennsylvanicum, serviceberry, redbud, huckleberry, blueberry and sparkleberry, holly, gallberry, azalea, rhododendron. Azaleas are a kind of rhododendron. willow, and bladdernut. The early spring azaleas are especially important for spring migration of hummingbirds. So let's see. I've only been around bladdernut in flower a few times, and I was astonished at the diversity of insects visiting the flowers, and I could have included at least 5 more photos to show you the other pollinators visiting. And it's got a beautiful little flower too. It's not as showy as the silver bell, but still very, very beautiful. And I actually grew one in a container. It's a small tree, so it does well in a container. So I snuck this little slide in because this is a holly, and where I live in the Piedmont of North Carolina, it's not native, but it's used as a tree in parking lots, and that's because it tolerates drought and heat. It's evergreen, and it has these beautiful berries, so it's a beautiful landscape plant and very versatile. But suppose you want to just stick with something that's totally native. How do you know? And so there's a wonderful flora for the Southeast that is Weekly's Flora, and I included links to that in the additional resources. There's also plants, the USDA plants database, and BONAP. And both of those, if you zoom into plants, then you'll get the same level of detail that you can see on BONAP at a glance. And BONAP stands for the Biota of North America program. So, and what about if it's invasive? And here's the link if you are curious to see if something is invasive in your area. And so I pulled these little diagrams to show you about Yaupon holly. This little triangle indicates that in the Piedmont, it is considered exotic in North Carolina and South Carolina, but it's considered native in the Piedmont in Georgia. And then these show that it's common in the coastal plain. So that's a wonderful resource you can download for free from the web. And I also downloaded Weekly's Flora of Virginia, which is a wonderful app on my phone, and I use it for identification a lot. So our pinkster bloom azalea is wonderful as hummingbirds are migrating north in the spring, but you can see that it's made for pollination by butterflies as well. Look where those flower parts are going to hit a butterfly. If a bee landed on those flowers, it's probably not going to be as effective in terms of pollination as a butterfly or a hummingbird. But they'll do it. So the azaleas, especially this little dwarf azalea, if you've ever been on the coastal plain in a field of this, you know how wonderfully fragrant it is. It's a beautiful, if you want a little tiny azalea, this is it. It's just gorgeous and fragrant. So, and this is another one that I have a hard time finding in nurseries, but I think it really deserves to be used more. Look how gorgeous the flowers are, and the foliage is just beautiful. And some of our native nurseries do carry it, but we have lots of native shrubs in the more conventional nursery industry, but this is one that hasn't made it there yet, and it may be a little bit, some things are hard to overwinter in containers. But blueberries grow very well. Of course, all of our conventional nurseries have a huge diversity of blueberries. It's better to plant more than one variety, so you'll get better production, but you'll get beautiful flowers no matter what, delicious fruit, and gorgeous, brilliant red fall color. So sometimes people have the invasive burning bushes that have that brilliant fall color, and you know, it's hard to beat the burning bushes, but the actual color for blueberry matches the burning bush, but not quite as dense a foliage usually. Mid-late spring blooming native shrubs and small trees include buckeye, New Jersey tea, fothergilla, holly, dog hobble, terrible name. I know I need to re-look up a different name for that. Mulberry, azalea, rhododendron again, and sumacs, roses, and brambles. So brambles is a term for blackberries and black raspberries, which are native. And of course, we have raspberries. Those aren't, just the straight raspberry isn't native here, but of course, they're still great for pollinators. But our black raspberry, of course, it is native and wonderful. So this flowering raspberry doesn't make edible fruit for us, but the bees love it and the flowers are stunning. And I love the foliage color too, and I'm sorry I didn't capture the leaf shape a little bit better, but it really is a beautiful shrub. And our summer blooming native shrubs and trees, the summer bloomers, a lot of them grow naturally in riparian or wetter sites, but nearly all grow well in average soil as well. Summer bloomers include devil's walking stick, New Jersey tea, buttonbush, sweet pepper bush, bush honeysuckle, wild hydrangea, sweet spire, wild rose, and meadowsweet. So sometimes people ask if butterflies are effective pollinators, and we already saw the azalea, but here you can actually see the pollen falling on the wings, and probably a butterfly is going to be more effective on buttonbush as well. Okay, and one thing else I wanted to highlight in terms of plants is vines. And they can be a wonderful addition, and they're especially wonderful if you love butterflies and caterpillars. And while I'm here, I just want to tell a story because sometimes those of us who are immersed in this work, we kind of take for granted what we know. And so a woman who managed the landscaping in a designed community in Western Virginia used to give butterfly habitat programs for her residents. And she told the story that at the end of one year, one of the residents came and talked to her. She said, you know, I did everything you said. I planted a diversity of host plants for butterflies, and all I saw, I was killing a lot of worms over the summer, but I didn't see any butterflies. So this story is a lot harder to tell over the web. But I hope you got the point that she didn't realize that caterpillars turned into butterflies. So please don't take that for granted. And more children don't have exposure to these things. So you can really make a difference just by helping someone understand that this beautiful little caterpillar is going to turn into a variegated fritillary butterfly.
Nancy, I'm just giving you an update on time. We're about 8 minutes to 2.
Okay, super, thank you. All right, so here's another wonderful vine that's native all over the South, and you can see the flower parts fit our carpenter bees perfectly, as they do bumblebees. In Mexico, they actually provide nesting blocks where they grow the passion fruit commercially. And it's a wonderful fruit to eat fresh if you like a sweet and sour type fruit. And in terms of jelly, it's one of the most fragrant jellies I've ever had. So this is I just want to tell this little ecology story. So here's that caterpillar we saw earlier. Here's its host plant, the pipe vine, and there's where it takes its name. It looks like a little pipe. And so I found this chrysalis pretty far from any sign of a pipe vine plant, and that caterpillar, I don't think it was an accident that it found this yellow birch for its chrysalis. What do you think? I mean, it matches perfectly. So this kind of connection, you know, we talk about host plants. We never think about the host plant being where it places its chrysalis. But so if you use an app like iNaturalist, and start documenting where you see a chrysalis and where you see any insect, you're going to help us understand connections like this one. So if 20 people captured a chrysalis of a pipevine swallowtail and 15 of them were on a Allegheny birch, then we're going to start thinking differently about what habitat is needed for that caterpillar. So this work by community scientists is tremendously valuable, and it's also fun to connect with other people that are documenting wildlife in your area. Alrighty, so here's another pollinator that depends on a vine. Okay, and then wildflowers are tremendously important. And I'm sorry, I'm gonna just skip through those pretty quickly. We have a bunch of specialist bees, and we have this website by Jared Fowler is excellent for specialist bees. And if you wanted to start growing things to attract those bees, that would be a good place to start. We all know about host plants for butterfly larvae, and most butterfly societies will give you a list for your area. But milkweed in particular is an excellent plant for a huge diversity of pollinators and predatory insects. I was so surprised to see this assassin bug nectaring when it must not have had enough insects to eat, so it needed to go get some nectar from that milkweed. And we have a wonderful diversity of milkweeds in the Southeast, but not all of them are available commercially. But the more we ask for these plants from nurseries, the more they will be available. And as a city, you can actually contract grow with a local native plant nursery. And then areas left unmown, these can be very important. And if you look at this photo on the left, those are mostly non-native weeds that overwinter. But if you visited this patch, instead of mowing it right away, if you left it in the spring, you'd be providing habitat for a big diversity, not only of bees, but I always see lady beetles in there and other predatory insects early in the spring. And then areas left unmown. So this is a roadside area in the Southeast, and I found this little top of that flower had these male bees roosting for the night on that. So they're easy to miss, but some natural areas disturbed periodically. So I talked about that earlier. So some mowing actually helps maintain that diversity, and mixing up the mowing regime, not mowing at the same exact time every year, is helpful. So in terms of cavity nesting, about 70% of our native bees nest in the ground, and a 30% nest in cavities or rotting wood. So we can really help, especially those 30% in cavities and rotting wood, by what we plant. And the ones that use legumes for nesting, for their nesting materials. So here's a pithy stem. I know it's a little bit hard to see, but when we opened up these old wing stem plants, every one had a little larva in it, and this could be a bee or a wasp or a beetle. I'm not good at identifying larvae. And for bumblebees, I'm leaving some grasses, but these are great for ground nesting birds as well. And this is something Chris Liloya did at the NC Botanical Garden. She knew how important those old stems were. And so when she was cleaning things up, and I don't remember whether she did it in the fall or the spring, I think she may have left things as long as they looked pretty nice. You know, a lot of our overwintering stems have seeds that are really good for insects and birds. But in the spring, when she wanted to make room for this new growth, she gathered up those stems, and rather than throwing them away or letting them go into a compost pile, she actually makes these little wattles. And she's created some signage so people understand what that's all about. But that previous slide I showed you explains why there's larvae. So this is some slides I'm going to go through really quickly about some places in the Southeast. This is a new demonstration planting at NCA&T, and we installed what we call a diverse native hedgerow. It's a mixture of shrubs and trees. We used little tiny tubelings, $2 tubelings from a wetland nursery, mainly for the plants, for the shrubs and trees. And then we did include some herbaceous plants so that there would be something that looked nice while those were growing, but also especially some of our native grasses are really beautiful, like this pink muley. And so you can support connections with nature and other communities. In Georgia, the Monarchs Across Georgia program and Journey North help children connect using this symbolic migration. And so these two, they learned about monarchs, but they also made some artwork to send to Mexico that is a symbolic trip to Mexico. And then, gosh, I'm blanking on, I can't believe I'm not thinking of her name. But she works with the children in Mexico, and they see what the children in the US looked at, and they will send back their own artwork when the monarchs migrate north in the spring. It's a wonderful, wonderful way to really give children a hands-on experience to help them understand these ecological connections. The Bee City and Bee City Bee Campus USA, they do all sorts of things. And these are just two examples. Bee City USA in Asheville, they had this amazing puppet show. And then here in Beecator, they have this pledge. Beecator's website is definitely worth visiting for inspiration. They have the most beautiful photographs, but they have this pollinator pledge. They're saying, urban environments like Decatur provide critical habitat for pollinators and other beneficial species. Please say you'll pledge to help support them. And then here's the Take the Pollinator Pledge. And here in Hendersonville, they created a meadow, and then they created signage to help people understand all of the critters they might see on those plants. If you want to see some wonderful videos, I encourage you to type Greenwood or Anne Barclow and YouTube and see some of her stories about the plants. She's just a wonderful media spokesperson. She uses the most delightful phrases to help people connect in the gardens that she creates. And here's another one we got to visit. Here's a planting in Atlanta, Georgia. The Trees Atlanta used Halesia silverbell for the shade trees they were putting in. And so what a wonderful combination of shade and flowering trees. And so this is going to benefit people as well with the shade and beauty. So here is something in Georgia. Again, the Connect to Protect program is really amazing from the State Botanical Garden of Georgia. Besides Connect to Protect, they put in these little, just little tiny patches of pollinator habitat. Wherever anybody is interested in doing it, they will partner to help them do these plantings, and then they'll add signage to help people in the neighborhood understand what the planting's all about. They also have a native plant certification program. And then I wish I had a better photograph of Karen, but she has, Karen Giovango has developed a wonderful demonstration garden at the Ecoscapes building in Brunswick, Georgia. And so you can learn all about it at this site about Ecoscapes. If you type in Ecoscapes on Google, there's a private company as well. You need to type in UGA Ecoscapes if you want to Google it. And then this is something you can visit virtually, the Pollinator Paradise Garden in Pittsboro, North Carolina. She has resources about everything, the pollinators, all the beneficial insects, the plants. This is a one-stop shop for anybody interested in planting a pollinator garden. And the NC Botanical Garden, this is the one that I highlighted with Chris Laloya's wattles. They actually showcase native plant communities. So you can walk through the garden and kind of experience a coastal plain wetland. And it's a really unique place, very, very special. And they even showcase using native plants in containers. So they have the most wonderful bog plants in containers. And these are, this is another place that at NC Charlotte. I'm sure there's lots of other wonderful gardens in the Southeast. I wanted to showcase this one. The Birmingham Botanical Gardens has a wonderful native plant conference that John Mannion started just a few years ago. The Cullowhee Native Plant Conference has been taking place. It's the oldest conference in the East for native plants, and it's a wonderful, wonderful event in July. So John Mannion started doing one in Birmingham at the Botanical Gardens in October. So it's a wonderful complement to the Cullowhee Conference. And all of these places have certificates if you want to learn about native plants or have your yard certified. So for planners, are we okay to go a couple more minutes? Rachel?
That's fine. It looks like we haven't lost any participants, so I think we are planning on going
Okay.
15 minutes
Hopefully
over.
it'll be about 5 or 10 minutes longer. So
yeah, I think that's
this
fine.
is for urban population. So, you know, we can see this growth, and I did a program for Green and Growing, which is a big green trade industry, and discovered all this literature on nature and public health. And so if you're trying to sell your city, there's a ton of information now available. And I know this seems kind of silly, exposure to, well, this used to seem kind of silly until COVID-19 hit. And so I think everybody really gets this message without me needing to share it. But there's lots of research, and I included those links on the slides in case you want to investigate. And so this one, I really wanted to include this. This is the media I mentioned a little bit earlier. But this here is at Jekyll Island. It's at the conference center on Jekyll Island in Georgia. And I think it was a little bit controversial when they wanted to put it in. There's a natural coastal dune community that's very important for protecting the coast of Georgia. And so one of the things they did in terms of mitigation or getting agreement from the community was to use all native plants in the design around the conference center. So it's very interesting. The center is just beautiful, a very formal building. All the plantings around the building are very formal as well, but they're actually using the actual dune plants. So it transitions from this very formal landscape naturally into this wonderful natural dune community. So it's really a great example of using native plants formally or informally. And then here in Greensboro, our our master gardeners use a great mix of native and non-native plants in their garden. And if you notice, these are sun-loving plants, but if you're in this garden, there's shade everywhere. It's comfortable to visit all season round, all season long. But they have lots of sun-loving plants because they've just peppered the trees to make it comfortable for people to visit. All right. And this is another example. This is a brand new park in Greensboro. They purposely put this row of trees here on the south side. So immediately, day one, when this park opened, there was a shady path for people to walk on. It was a really excellent design. And again, they used some really beautiful native trees. So our sourwood is one of the specimen trees. And of course, it gets beautiful flowers. And if you've ever seen a sourwood in fall, you cannot beat that red color on a sourwood, one of the most beautiful trees ever. And there is a sweet bay magnolia being used in a rain garden in a city, urban city. It makes a great plant. And so I'm not going to cover all these things about millennials, but I thought it was so interesting what they cared about. And you can take a look at these slides a little bit more later. And again, riparian areas, I like to include this slide because these documents, Working Trees for Pollinators and working trees for wildlife are from the National Agroforestry Center. If you're an educator, you can click on their site and order as many of these to give away at a talk as you would like. So that's a really nice resource for educators if they want to have something to hand out, and they're beautiful documents. And then this riparian, I always like to mention pawpaw, and it's a great riparian plant, but it does great in average soils, and of course it produces not only absolutely delicious fruit, but these beautiful caterpillars and adult butterflies that depend on it to survive. If those trees disappeared, we'd lose those butterflies. So in terms of planning, one of the most important things is to get the grounds crew involved. And this can be hard a lot of times. You know, something from the top, somebody at the top says they want to see this, but the benefits to getting the crew involved are multiple. So they usually know what has been tried in the past. So they know what failed in the past, and so they have a better idea of where something might be successful. And they've probably been thinking about those grounds for longer than anybody else. So they might have some good ideas to share. And usually, you know, you can find a native substitute if they have something that they had in mind. Usually you can find a good compromise. But if you get the crews involved from the get-go, it's a lot more likely that over the long run, the planting's going to be successful. And then these are some resources. I learned about native plants in Maryland. So I love this guide that was put together for schoolyards and community habitat. But there's a wonderful environmental alliance, the Monarchs Across Georgia. All their resources are on this website. There's a Georgia related link that I also included. And then Captain Planet Foundation also has great resources, and they're based in Atlanta. So signage is really important. Using any kind of artwork is wonderful. And I have a beautiful bee house from the a natural area in Birmingham a little bit later. So sometimes people worry about pollen, but plants that require pollinators, they actually don't cause allergies. It's only things that are wind pollinated that cause allergies. So you can help people remember that. You never see a plant that needs a pollinator in those pollen counts. And here's some fun look at pollen through the growing season. This is what a mason bee carried back to her nest. And so this is redbud, was very important in early spring. Oak trees, who knew that oak would be so important for a bee? That's a wind pollinated plant. But in early spring, that's a big part of her pollen load. By late spring, look what was really important, poison ivy. So these plants that sometimes we think of as nuisance plants are supporting a lot of pollinators. And if you can help people relate to the critters that use them, then chances are they'll be happier with those plants. Okay, and then this is a simple thing you can do if you're worried about social wasps. This is a fake social wasp nest. When we first built this little shed at a community garden, I knocked social wasps out of that shed every 2 weeks. And after I put up this little paper wasp, you can get them two for $10 through Amazon, and or from your local, maybe some local place would have them. But it's been up for 5 years. We never had any wasp nesting there again. What happens is they think another female has already started her nest. They also, like other bees and wasps, are social place, central place nesters. So when they see that wasp nest, they say, gee, there's not going to be enough food for me and my family later on this year if somebody's already living here. Whoops. So this is a bee observation or a solitary bee wasp observation house. And if you can also use bamboo, which is great. But if you get this little door opens up and you can actually watch them nesting. And I'm sorry I didn't get a slide in there to show that. You can find that online. So here's the iNaturalist tool. I'm not going to talk about that right now, but it's a great way to connect. Xerces has a tremendous set of resources that are more and more specifically for home gardeners, including this one, supporting ecologically sound mosquito management. One thing that we, I think, deserves a lot more attention is this wonderful database, the IPI, which stands for Impacts of Pesticides on Invertebrates database. And it's actually an annotated bibliography of research articles. So you can put in any topic and pull up all the articles that are related to that. So if you're interested in honeybees or bumblebees or a specific pesticide, you can see what research and find a beautiful little summary of the article that our Xerces staff provide. So here's that beautiful little beehive from the Ruffner Mountain Nature Preserve in Birmingham. So this is artwork. You know, this is probably an effective bee house, but it's also really fun to look at. They had a little competition for artists to come up with different bee hotels or bee homes. These are some of the resources, and you can go to our resource center and click on the Southeast and find resources. We have a number of books you can buy, and but we have a huge number of things that are for free to download online. And here's that little Yard, Gardens, and Parks Habitat Assessment Guide. It has illustrations inside of all the key elements for a yard. So it's a wonderful educational tool if you're working with somebody who wants to know what can they do in their own yard. And so lots and lots of great resources. For the Southeast, we have the Southeast region, the regular pollinator list, and then we have this other ones that are specifically for monarchs. So there's one for, Xerces put North Carolina in the mid-Atlantic. So if you're North Carolina, then you could use the Southeast just as well as the mid-Atlantic. But if you look at the little map, and that's how it works. And then we also have one for Florida. And we have a new set of documents about milkweeds in particular. It was designed for roadside folks with the Federal Highway Administration. And you can find those on our website too. Just put roadside monarchs. And what's neat about this one, the monarch butterfly nectar plant list for conservation plantings, there's one for the Southeast and the Mid-Atlantic and Florida. It shows the months that monarchs are generally most active. Although new research has found that monarchs are present in, at least in South Carolina coastal plain, north of Charleston all year round, except for 1 month, the field researcher Billy McCord has found. He's not convinced that they aren't there that other month. He just hasn't found any caterpillars or adults yet. And this is another tool Xerces Society Pollinator Specialist Jennifer Hopwood put together. It's for the Federal Highway Administration built this plant database that's wonderful on its own. You can go, you can choose the location. You click on the map to pull up an ecoregion, or you can click on a state. And then if you click on the ecoregion, you use this first panel to scroll over to your ecoregion. So in this case, the Southeastern Plains, that's what this gray is. And then you can scroll over in this set of information over to the benefits for pollinators. And this is what Jennifer Hopwood has added. Xerces helped develop lists on the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center's website, special collections for native bees, and the Bamona, the butterfly organization, developed the same thing for the Lady Bird Johnson for butterflies. But Jennifer put together all of this additional information for this ecoregional revegetation application. And so you can see here, this is also cool. It has commercial availability. It shows you when they last checked. but then pollinator value, benefits to pollinators, and then the actual pollinators that might use the plant. So it's a really cool tool. You can download just for your state. You can download just trees or shrubs or herbs. It's really, really, really neat. And then we have this guide, even though it says Upper Midwest, it's great for this region. It has this beautiful chart showing the families. It says, because up in the upper Midwest, they don't have any Melitidae. In the Southeast, we do have Macropis and Melita. So it's a beautiful little chart. North Carolina now has its own little native plant guide, and that link is in the additional resources. Georgia has a beautiful native bee website that Nick, I'm blanking on his name, his last name, put together, but that's also on the additional resources. And so this is where you go to our site. If you just put Xerces bee monitoring, it'll come up, but that's the one that I think is best for our region and that has all this great information. Xerces helped put together these caterpillar lists that are from the University of Florida's Butterfly Museum. And the other side of this sheet, you can get it at this link, is all the milkweed species that monarchs depend on. And then, you know, sometimes people aren't so sure about, you know, whether this is of primary interest, but when we work with farmers and we do some scouting, which we just go and see what we can find in a few minutes, usually 95% of the critters that people bring back are either pollinators or predators, and about 5% tend to be pests. So it's a real eye-opener when people start to do these simple scouting, maybe once a month or once every 2 weeks, and start to learn what the predatory insects look like. It changes their outlook. They realize that there's a lot more predators there than pests if they aren't using pesticides. And then Xerces YouTube channel, and thank you, Rachel has really spearheaded creation of these beautiful, beautiful videos. And my favorite is the one with Matthew Shepard, Brilliant Bees. It's only 10 minutes or 8 minutes and a half. Even though he's talking about things out in the Pacific Northwest, he's really just talking about getting outside and exploring, and it's a really delightful 8.5 minutes. And every one of the videos I've seen has been totally beautiful. I haven't been able to see them all. And I just wanted to point out that there's a whole set on freshwater mussels, and then we've got 3 in Spanish I didn't even know about. So it's just wonderful. And then the series that we're doing now, so this is the one that Kelly Gill just did a couple weeks ago, and the one that we're doing today, unless Rachel says it's just too bad, will hopefully be up here in a little while. So let's see. And then, of course, we have all these ways to connect through our social media. And just want you to remember about pollinator habitat, the key things are shelter, so nest sites, refuge, and overwintering sites. Food is what we generally think about, nectar, pollen, caterpillar host plants, and specialist bee host plants. And then protection and management. So in the Southeast, prescribed fire is wonderful. If you can sneak that in, especially a summertime burn in some of our communities can really restore some amazing native diversity. And then pesticide risk mitigation. So again, the presentation, and I included this link in the chat. If you came on early, you should be able to click on it directly. And I posted a copy of the presentation and additional resources there. I love this quote from Richard Louv in Last Child in the Woods. I only read this book last year, and I had no idea how research-based it was. It's just packed full of research about the importance of nature for our well-being. And so if you need any support for any of the work you're doing. It's a great source for inspiration. And there's that beautiful pipevine swallowtail caterpillar. So that's the adult that we saw earlier as the larva, and then that beautiful chrysalis on black birch. And there's the gorgeous adult on one of our native tiger lily, Turk's cap lily. So, all right. So thank you very, very much.